Magnus Erikson's cabin stayed at 68 degrees, while his neighbors burned through a month's worth of firewood in 10 days. The secret wasn't his fire, it was what lay buried beneath 4 feet of snow that no one could see until the worst cold snap in 20 years forced them to ask how he was still alive. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if frontier survival stories like this one inspire you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than what you're about to hear. The door froze shut on the morning of January 8, 1842. Magnus Erikson stood inside his cabin in the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory, watching ice crystals spread across the interior surface of his door like white fingers reaching inward. The temperature outside had dropped to 40 degrees below zero overnight. Inside, despite a fire that had burned continuously for 6 hours, the cabin felt cold enough that his breath came out in thick clouds. This was Magnus's 4th winter in the mountains. He trapped beaver and marten along the tributaries of the Wind River, working a territory that stretched 15 miles in any direction from his cabin. He was 28 years old, born in Minnesota to Swedish immigrant parents who had died of fever when he was 16. He had come west in 1838 with nothing but a rifle, basic supplies, and the carpentry skills his father had taught him. The cabin he had built that first autumn was typical of frontier construction. Logs notched at the corners, moss chinked between gaps. A single door facing south to catch whatever winter sun might appear. One small window covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace he had labored over for 2 weeks. The structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet inside. It had served him adequately through 3 winters. But this morning, staring at the ice spreading across his door, Magnus realized something he had been ignoring. Every time he opened that door, heat escaped. Not just a little warmth, but a massive wave of precious heat that took hours to rebuild. In moderate winter weather, this was merely inefficient. In extreme cold like today, it was becoming dangerous. He had opened the door twice already since dawn. Once to bring in firewood from the stack outside, once to check his trap lines and retrieve frozen meat from the cache he kept buried in snow 20 yards from the cabin. Each time, the blast of Arctic air that rushed in had dropped the interior temperature so dramatically that frost formed on the stone fireplace. Each time, it took 90 minutes of burning wood to restore even basic warmth. Magnus did the mathematics in his head. He had 1/4 quart of split firewood remaining. In normal winter conditions, that would last 6 weeks. But if he had to keep compensating for heat loss every time he opened the door, and if this cold snap continued, he would run out of wood in less than 3 weeks. And cutting more wood in 40 below zero temperatures was not just difficult, it was potentially fatal. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Sweat from exertion would soak clothing and then freeze solid. Axes became brittle and could shatter on impact. Magnus had learned about heat loss the hardest way possible. The previous winter, he had not trapped alone. Thomas Whitmore, an Englishman from Yorkshire who had come to America in 1836, had partnered with him for the 1840 to 1841 season. Thomas was 32 years old, experienced in the mountains, and capable with tools. They had worked well together, splitting the labor of trapping, processing pelts, and maintaining their camp. Their partnership had been profitable. By March of 1841, they had accumulated nearly 200 beaver pelts and 40 marten skins. The furs were valuable enough that both men would return to street. Louis, with substantial earnings. They had survived the winter in good health, their food supplies adequate, their cabin solid. Then came the late-season cold snap. March 18, 1841. Spring should have been arriving. Instead, temperatures plummeted, 45 degrees below zero for 3 consecutive nights. Magnus and Thomas had burned through their remaining firewood faster than anticipated because they kept opening the door, retrieving more wood from outside. Checking trap lines one final time. Each door opening cost them heat they could not easily replace. On the 3rd night of extreme cold, they ran critically low on firewood. Thomas volunteered to go outside and split more logs from their reserve pile. Magnus argued against it. The cold was too severe. They should burn furniture if necessary, anything to avoid prolonged exposure. But Thomas insisted. He was the stronger of the two men. He would work quickly. Thomas went outside, wearing every layer of clothing he owned. He took the axe to the wood pile 30 yards from the cabin. Magnus watched from the window, maintaining the fire inside, waiting for Thomas to return. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Magnus pulled on his own layers and went outside to check. He found Thomas collapsed beside the woodpile. The Englishman had split perhaps a dozen logs before succumbing to the cold. He had been sweating from the exertion. The sweat had soaked his inner layers. In 45 below zero, the moisture had frozen solid against his skin. His core temperature had dropped catastrophically. By the time Magnus reached him, Thomas was unconscious. Magnus dragged his partner back to the cabin, struggling with the dead weight across snow and darkness. He got Thomas inside and tried everything he knew to revive him, wrapped him in blankets near the fire, forced warm liquid between his lips, rubbed his limbs to restore circulation. Nothing worked. Thomas Whitmore died 2 hours before dawn without regaining consciousness. Magnus buried Thomas in April when the ground thawed enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones and a wooden cross. He completed the trapping season alone, sold the furs in street, Louis, and gave Thomas's share to an address in Yorkshire that Thomas had once mentioned. Then he returned to the mountains for another season, haunted by a single thought that would not leave him. His partner had died because they needed firewood. They needed firewood because they kept losing heat. They kept losing heat because they kept opening the door. Magnus spent the summer of 1841 thinking about doors. He trapped through spring, sold his furs in June, and instead of spending his earnings on supplies and heading back to the mountains immediately, he stayed in St. Louis for 5 weeks. He watched buildings. He studied how people in the city dealt with cold. What he noticed was that wealthy homes had 2 doors, an outer door that opened to the street, then a small enclosed space, then an inner door that opened to the living areas. Magnus asked a carpenter about this design. The man explained it was called a vestibule. It prevented cold air from rushing directly into the warm house. When someone entered from outside, they opened the outer door, stepped into the small space, closed the outer door, then opened the inner door. The cold air that came in with them stayed trapped in the vestibule instead of flooding the entire house. Magnus also noticed that some buildings had basement entrances. Steps led down below street level to doors that opened into underground storage rooms. These basement rooms stayed warmer in winter than the streets above because earth insulated them. The principle was simple. Soil held heat better than air. The deeper you went underground, the more stable the temperature became. He visited the docks and watched men unloading goods from warehouses built partially underground. These structures stayed cool in summer and relatively warm in winter without requiring fires. The earth itself acted as insulation. Magnus asked questions. How deep did you need to build to gain thermal benefit? The answers varied, but most men agreed that even 3 or 4 feet of earth coverage made a significant difference. Magnus also observed root cellars. Farmers dug them to store vegetables through winter. The cellars were simple: a hole in the ground, reinforced walls, a roof covered with soil, and a door or hatch for access. Inside these cellars, temperatures rarely dropped below freezing, even when surface temperatures were well below zero. The stored vegetables survived winter undamaged because the earth protected them from temperature extremes. A pattern emerged in Magnus's mind. Cold air was the enemy. Direct exposure to cold air was what stole heat from his cabin. Every time he opened his door, he created a direct connection between the warm interior and the freezing exterior. The cold rushed in because cold air was denser than warm air. It sank and displaced the warm air upward and outward. Within seconds of opening his door in extreme cold, the cabin's interior temperature dropped 10 degrees or more. But what if the door did not open directly to the outside? What if there was a space between the cabin and the exterior cold, a space that could absorb the cold air and prevent it from reaching the living area? A space that stayed warmer than the outside because it was protected from direct exposure. Magnus returned to the mountains in late July 1841 with a plan forming. He did not know yet exactly how he would build it, but he knew what he needed: a way to enter and exit his cabin without opening a door directly to the outside air. Magnus returned to his cabin in the Wind River Range in early August 1841. He did not immediately begin trapping. Instead, he spent 2 weeks conducting experiments that other mountain men would have considered insane. He dug holes in the ground and measured temperatures. He started with a simple test. He dug a hole 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. He placed a tin cup of water at the bottom. Overnight, the surface temperature dropped to near freezing, typical for high-altitude August nights. In the morning, he retrieved the cup. The water was cool, but not frozen. The earth had insulated it from the freezing air above. He dug a second hole 5 feet deep, same diameter, same tin cup of water at the bottom. The next morning, the water was noticeably warmer than in the shallower hole. The additional depth provided additional insulation. Magnus understood the principle now. Earth was a thermal mass. It absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature became because you were farther from the extreme fluctuations happening at the surface. He dug a third hole, this one 6 feet deep, but only 18 inches wide. He lined the bottom with flat stones. He placed a small piece of burning wood on the stones, creating smoke. Then he covered the top of the hole with a piece of canvas weighted with rocks, leaving only a small gap for smoke to escape. He waited an hour, then carefully removed the canvas and climbed down to check the temperature. The hole was warm. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. The stone at the bottom had absorbed heat from the fire and was radiating it into the enclosed space. More importantly, even after the fire went out, the warmth persisted for hours because the earth walls trapped it. Magnus tried a horizontal experiment. He dug a trench 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, and 2 feet wide. He covered half of it with logs and then buried the logs under 2 feet of soil. He left the other half open to the air. Over 3 days, he monitored temperatures in both sections during daytime heat and nighttime cold. The covered section maintained stable temperature. The open section fluctuated wildly. The soil covering acted as insulation, preventing heat from escaping at night and preventing excessive heat from entering during the day. The principle was clear. An underground space, properly covered, would maintain temperature far better than any above-ground structure. Old Pierre Duchamp, a French-Canadian trapper who passed through in mid-August, saw Magnus digging and asked what he was doing. Magnus explained his theory. Pierre listened, then shared something useful. Indigenous peoples in the far north built partially underground shelters, sod houses. They dug down, built up walls, and covered everything with earth. These structures stayed warm with minimal fire because the earth did most of the insulating work. Magnus thanked Pierre for the information. After the old trapper left, Magnus began sketching plans in charcoal on a flat piece of bark. Magnus began construction in late August 1841. His plan was unconventional. He would dig a tunnel starting 15 feet from his cabin door, sloping downward to a depth of 4 feet below ground level, then leveling out and continuing underground until it connected with his cabin through a new entrance cut into the cabin's foundation logs. The concept was simple, but the execution would be difficult. He needed a passage large enough for a man to move through while carrying firewood or supplies. He needed the tunnel roof strong enough to support soil and snow weight. He needed the entry point positioned so that cold air entering from outside would sink to the lowest point of the tunnel and stay trapped there rather than rising into the cabin. He started by marking the route with wooden stakes. The tunnel would run 16 feet total length. The first 8 feet would descend at a slight angle, dropping 4 feet in elevation. The middle section would remain level for 4 feet, creating a cold trap at the lowest point. The final 4 feet would rise slightly to meet the cabin floor level. Digging began with the exterior entrance. Magnus excavated a rectangular pit 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall, and 6 feet long. He removed the soil carefully, piling it nearby for later use. The ground was dense with roots and rocks. Each foot of progress required hours of work with a shovel, pickaxe, and his bare hands. Once the entrance pit reached 4 feet deep, he began the horizontal excavation. This was more difficult. He worked lying on his side, using a short-handled spade to scrape soil loose, then dragging it backward out of the tunnel. The work was claustrophobic and exhausting. Soil fell into his face. His shoulders scraped against the tunnel walls. Progress was measured in inches per hour. After 3 days, he had excavated 8 feet of horizontal tunnel. Now came the critical engineering challenge. He needed to roof the tunnel with logs strong enough to support the weight of soil and snow that would eventually cover it. He selected logs 8 to 10 inches in diameter, stripped the bark, and shaped them to consistent dimensions. He laid these logs horizontally across the top of the tunnel, spanning from one side to the other. Each log was positioned tightly against the next, minimizing gaps. Where the logs met the tunnel walls, he carved notches into the earth walls themselves, creating pockets that the log ends sat in. This distributed the weight into the surrounding soil rather than relying on any vertical supports. Over the log roof, he laid strips of bark to prevent soil from sifting through the gaps. Then he packed clay mixed with grass into every crack between logs, creating a seal. The clay dried hard, binding the logs together into a unified structure. Once the roof was complete, he began backfilling. He shoveled soil over the log roof, building up a layer 2 feet thick. The weight compressed everything below, but the logs held. Magnus crawled through the tunnel, checking for any signs of collapse or weakness. Everything remained solid. Bill Hutchins arrived at Magnus's cabin in early September 1841. Hutchins was a veteran trapper, 43 years old, who had worked the Rocky Mountains for 16 years. He was passing through on his way to his own winter territory, 30 miles north. He saw the disturbed earth around Magnus's cabin and the strange mound of soil near the entrance. He asked what Magnus was building. Magnus explained the tunnel, how it would provide underground access to the cabin, how the earth would insulate it, how cold air would sink to the lowest point and stay trapped there instead of entering the living space, how this would solve the heat loss problem that killed Thomas Whitmore. Hutchins listened with increasing disbelief. When Magnus finished, Hutchins laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a full laugh that lasted several seconds. He told Magnus he was wasting time on foolishness. Cabins had doors. Doors open to the outside. That was how buildings worked. Digging tunnels like a badger was insane. The tunnel would collapse under snow weight. It would flood with spring melt. It would trap Magnus inside if the entrance froze over. And even if it somehow worked, the effort required to build it could have been spent trapping beaver and earning money. Hutchins left, still shaking his head. Within 2 weeks, every trapper within 50 miles had heard about Magnus Erikson's tunnel. The story spread through the loose network of mountain men who crossed paths while checking trap lines or visiting the few trading posts scattered through the territory. Frank Morrison, who trapped the creek drainage 8 miles east, made a special trip to see the construction. He arrived in late September when Magnus was completing the cabin connection. Morrison examined the tunnel entrance, peered into the dark passage, and declared it the stupidest thing he had seen in 12 years of mountain life. He told Magnus that real mountain men did not need fancy tricks to stay warm. A good fire and thick blankets were sufficient. If you could not handle normal winter conditions, you should not be in the mountains. At the trading post on the Green River, trappers gathered in October before winter isolation set in. Magnus arrived to purchase his winter supplies: flour, coffee, salt, powder, and lead. While he was inside, he overheard conversations. Men were calling his tunnel Erikson's Burrow. Some said he had lost his mind after Thomas died. Others said he was too soft for mountain life and was trying to recreate city comforts in the wilderness. A few suggested he should go back to Minnesota, where people built ridiculous things. Magnus purchased his supplies without responding to the comments. He loaded his pack and left. On the 3-day journey back to his cabin, he thought about their criticism. Maybe they were right. Maybe he had wasted a month of good trapping weather on a project that would fail. Maybe the tunnel would collapse or flood or prove useless. But he also remembered Thomas Whitmore, dying on the cabin floor, and he knew that whatever the other trappers thought, he would not make the same mistake twice. The first significant snow came in mid-November 1841. 6 inches fell overnight, covering the tunnel entrance and the mound of earth surrounding it. Magnus woke to a white landscape and immediately went outside to check his construction. The tunnel entrance was buried but not blocked. He shoveled away the accumulated snow from the opening, creating a clear path down into the passage. Over the next 2 weeks, snow continued falling intermittently. By early December, the ground was covered with 18 inches of snowpack. The tunnel entrance remained visible only because Magnus kept it clear. But the roof of the tunnel, the entire 16-foot length running underground to his cabin, had completely disappeared beneath snow and earth. From any distance, there was no indication that a tunnel existed. The landscape appeared unbroken, except for the small entrance opening that looked like nothing more than a dark hole in the snow. Magnus tested the system during a moderately cold week in mid-December. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero at night. He began using the tunnel exclusively, leaving his original cabin door barred from the inside. To exit the cabin, he opened the new interior door he had cut into the floor logs, descended 3 feet down a wooden ladder into the tunnel, crawled through the 16-foot passage, and climbed out the exterior entrance. The process was awkward. The tunnel was too low for standing. He had to crouch or crawl. Carrying firewood through required dragging it behind him. But the thermal benefit was immediately obvious. When he opened the tunnel door inside his cabin, no blast of cold air entered. The air coming from the tunnel was cold, but not Arctic. The earth insulation and the trapped air in the passage created a buffer. The tunnel interior stayed around 20 degrees, even when the outside temperature was 10 below zero. More importantly, when he returned to the cabin after spending time outside, he entered through the tunnel, closed the exterior entrance behind him, crawled through the passage, and climbed up into the cabin. The cold air that came with him stayed in the tunnel. It sank to the lowest point of the passage and remained there. The cabin's warm air never directly contacted the exterior cold. Magnus monitored his firewood consumption. In comparable cold weather the previous year, he had burned through half a cord of wood per week, maintaining cabin temperature. Now, using the tunnel system, he burned less than a quarter cord. The reduction was dramatic. His fire still burned continuously, but the cabin retained heat so effectively that he needed far less fuel. By late December, the snowpack had increased to 30 inches. The tunnel was completely invisible. Only the entrance remained, a small opening that could easily be missed unless you knew where to look. Magnus realized the tunnel had a secondary benefit he had not anticipated. It was hidden. Anyone approaching his cabin would see the structure itself, but would have no idea how he was entering or exiting. The security advantage was unintentional but valuable. The Arctic front arrived on January 6, 1842. Magnus woke that morning to a silence that was itself ominous. No wind. No bird sounds, just absolute stillness and a cold that hurt to breathe. He checked the thermometer he kept hanging outside his window. 38 degrees below zero. By evening, it had dropped to 42 below. The cold intensified overnight. 45 below zero, then 48. The second night reached 51 degrees below zero, the coldest temperature Magnus had ever experienced. The air itself seemed to crystallize. His breath froze instantly into ice particles that tinkled as they fell. Any exposed skin went numb within 30 seconds. Inside his cabin, Magnus maintained a constant fire. The flames consumed wood steadily, radiating heat into the small space. But even with the fire burning hot, the interior temperature struggled to stay above 50 degrees. The cold outside was so extreme it penetrated the log walls despite the chinking. Frost formed on the interior walls in the corners farthest from the fireplace, but the cabin remained livable. Magnus wore layers of wool and fur even inside. He kept water near the fire to prevent freezing. He rationed his firewood carefully, knowing he had enough for 3 weeks if he maintained current consumption. The tunnel system was working exactly as designed. He exited twice daily through the underground passage to retrieve firewood from his outdoor cache and to check his immediate surroundings. Each trip through the tunnel took 5 minutes. Each trip would have required opening his main door directly to the outside if he had used traditional cabin design. 8 miles away, Frank Morrison was in crisis. Morrison's cabin had a standard door opening directly outside. Every time he opened that door to get firewood, the interior temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. He was burning through wood at an unsustainable rate, trying to compensate. By the third night of extreme cold, he had exhausted his indoor wood supply and faced a terrible choice. Go outside repeatedly to bring in more wood, losing massive amounts of heat with each trip, or let the fire die and risk freezing. Morrison chose to keep the fire burning. He made 6 trips outside on the third night alone, each time opening his door, rushing out into lethal cold, grabbing armloads of firewood, and rushing back inside. Each door opening cost him heat he could barely replace. By the 4th night, his cabin interior was hovering around freezing despite the fire. Ice formed on his water bucket. His bedding was stiff with frost. 12 miles north, Bill Hutchins faced similar problems. His cabin was better built than Morrison's, but the basic design was the same. Door to outside, heat loss with every opening, unsustainable wood consumption. By the 6th night of the cold snap, Hutchins had burned through his entire month's supply of cut firewood. He was now splitting frozen logs in 50 below temperatures, a dangerous job that left him exhausted and at risk of frostbite. The cold snap continued. 7 nights, 8 nights, 9 nights. Magnus maintained his routine. Fire burning constantly, but not excessively. 2 trips per day through the tunnel to retrieve firewood and check his traps near the cabin. Interior temperature holding steady between 55 and 60 degrees. His wood supply remained adequate. He had burned through less than half a cord in 9 days. At this rate, he could survive another month of extreme cold if necessary. On the 10th night, the temperature finally began rising, 40 below, then 35. By morning of the 11th day, it had climbed to 20 below zero, which felt almost warm by comparison. The worst had passed. Frank Morrison appeared at Magnus's tunnel entrance on the 12th day. He looked terrible, face wind-burned and showing signs of frostbite on his cheeks. Eyes exhausted. He had walked 8 miles through deep snow to reach Magnus's cabin. He asked if he could come inside. Magnus helped Morrison through the tunnel and into the cabin. The warmth inside shocked Morrison visibly. He stood near the fire, trembling, and asked how Magnus had kept the cabin so warm. Magnus explained the tunnel system, how it prevented heat loss, how cold air stayed trapped in the passage, how the earth insulation maintained stable temperature, how he had burned less than half a cord of wood during the entire 10-day cold snap. Morrison listened without interrupting. When Magnus finished, Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he had been wrong. He had mocked the tunnel as foolishness. But he had nearly died in his cabin during the past 10 days. His firewood was gone. His interior had been freezing despite constant fire. He had suffered frostbite making repeated trips outside, and Magnus, who everyone had called insane, was comfortable and safe with wood to spare. Morrison asked if Magnus would help him build a similar tunnel. Magnus agreed. They waited 2 days for the temperature to stabilize, then traveled to Morrison's cabin. The work took a week. Magnus supervised while Morrison did most of the digging. They built a tunnel identical to Magnus's design. Entrance 15 feet from the cabin. Descending passage to 4 feet depth. Level section for cold trap. Rising section to cabin connection. Log roof. Clay ceiling. Earth covering. Bill Hutchins arrived at Magnus's cabin 3 days after Morrison left. Hutchins also looked exhausted. He also asked about the tunnel. He also admitted he had been wrong. Magnus spent another week helping Hutchins build a tunnel at his location. Word spread differently this time. The trappers who had survived. The 10-night cold snap wanted to know how Magnus had done it. The mockery stopped. Men started calling it the Erikson Tunnel instead of Erikson's Burrow. By spring of 1842, 5 more trappers had built similar systems. By the following winter, the number had doubled. The technique that had been considered insane in September was considered essential by February. Magnus never claimed credit or asked for payment. He simply shared what he had learned. Magnus Erikson continued trapping in the Wind River Range through 1846. His tunnel system never failed. Every winter, the snow buried the passage completely, leaving only the small entrance visible. Every winter, he entered and exited through the underground route, maintaining cabin warmth with minimal firewood. The design proved so effective that he eventually expanded it, adding a second branch that led to his outdoor food cache, creating a completely sheltered path between cabin and supplies. Other trappers refined the basic design. Jacob Reinhardt, a German trapper working territory near South Pass, built a tunnel system with a ventilation shaft that allowed smoke from a small fire inside the tunnel itself. The fire warmed the passage, making it comfortable to move through even in extreme cold. Others experimented with different entrance designs. Some built wooden covers that could be opened and closed like cellar doors. Some added stone flooring to prevent mud during spring thaw. The principles remained consistent across all variations: underground construction, earth insulation, descending entrance to create cold trap, connection to cabin that prevented direct exposure between warm interior and cold exterior. Every adaptation improved efficiency or convenience, but maintained the core physics that made the system work. By 1845, the technique had spread beyond the immediate trapping community. Settlers moving into Wyoming and Montana territories heard about the tunnel, cabins. Some adopted the design for their homesteads. Winter survival rates improved measurably in areas where the technique was used. Families stayed warmer with less firewood. Livestock shelters built with underground access protected animals better than traditional barn construction. The historical record shows scattered references to underground entry systems in frontier structures from the late 1840s through the 1860s. Most descriptions lack detail, but the essential elements match Magnus's original design. Passages running underground from exterior entrance to cabin interior. Earth and snow providing insulation. Cold air traps preventing heat loss. The terminology varied by region. Some called them burrows, others called them cold tunnels or earth entries. But the function was identical. Magnus left the mountains in 1847. The fur trade was dying as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats. He moved to Oregon Territory, married a woman named Sarah Lindstrom in 1848, and established a farm in the Willamette Valley. He built his farmhouse with an underground root cellar accessed by a tunnel from the main house. The design kept his stored food fresh and provided a warm passage during winter. Neighbors noticed, and several built similar systems. Magnus died in 1873 at age 59. His obituary in the Oregon City newspaper mentioned his farming success, but said nothing about his trapping years or the innovation that had saved lives. His tunnel system in the Wind River Range was eventually abandoned when the cabin collapsed in the 1880s. The entrance filled with soil and debris. The passage itself, buried 4 feet underground, likely still exists, invisible beneath accumulated earth and vegetation, a hidden testament to one man's refusal to accept that winter survival required constant suffering.